Hello, welcome to AP World History, Unit 5.2, Coronavirus Edition. Today we'll be continuing on with nationalism and revolutions. Remember that in Unit 5.1, we discussed the Enlightenment, and today in Unit 5.2, we will discuss how those ideas are basically put into action throughout the world. So, uh, the Enlightenment ideas that we discussed in Unit 5.1 are going to come into conflict with the traditional conservative ideas that were prevalent around the world in the mid to late 1700s. And this clash of ideas will lead to physical conflict as well and an age of revolutions. These revolutions are based on the Enlightenment ideas: progress, reason, and natural law, which we discussed in Unit 5.1. And we can generally say that these nationalist movements and revolutions are going to have two major goals in common, right? First, a desire for constitutional government, a government that is bound by laws and rules, as opposed to absolute monarchy, where kings and queens have a divine right to do whatever they want. And so a constitutional government, on the other hand, is basically run by a set of rules. All right. So a good way to think of it is rule of law instead of rule by man. Okay. And then, of course, the second major goal that many of these revolutions have in common is a desire for democracy, the right to vote, right? Which is, of course, directly opposed to the ideas in absolute monarchy. All right, so the next thing I'd like to do is define some of the key terms that we're discussing here, right? So, first, nationalism can generally be described, right, as an ideology or movement that promotes the interests of a particular nation. Now, when we describe nation, it can mean several different things. A group of people that we would say generally share a cultural heritage and linguistically, religiously, sometimes politically, but not necessarily. Um, and this group of people are looking to gain and maintain power over their own land or what they understand to be their land. All right. So I think it's very important to understand or think about nationalism as very much a subjective point of view, right? Who is a member of the nation and who is not is subjective, not necessarily objective. Okay. So it is based on this sort of what we could describe as a loose system of shared beliefs and similarities. Okay. Now, as we continue through this unit, especially, I would like to remind us of our AP World History themes. All right. First, social, right? How are the interactions between people? Political, the power structures then of government, how are they going to be affected? Um, the interactions between humans and the environment, how is the environment itself going to be affected by these revolutions and movements? And see cultural, right? How are things going to change culturally within these societies? Economics, how are these revolutions going to affect economics? And finally, technology and innovation. I'd also like to define revolution, just a quick recap of what we've already discussed, right? A sudden, radical, or complete change, sometimes politically, but not necessarily, right? Sometimes in social economic situations, um, sometimes in a fundamental way about thinking about the world, or technology, right? So when we talk about political organizations or being overthrown, example B, the French Revolution, activity or movement designed to affect fundamental changes in the socioeconomic situation. We might think about uh, the uh, Industrial Revolution, right? Or the Protestant Reformation. Or D, a fundamental change in a way of thinking about something, a change of paradigm. We discussed the scientific revolution where we stopped thinking about things in terms of superstition, but in terms of what we can actually prove, right? A changeover, and then an example of E for technology. Again, the Industrial Revolution, the information revolution that we're currently in is another example of that as well, right? So we know that revolution doesn't necessarily limit itself to only political change, right? And it's certainly all of these examples are going to have far-reaching effects well beyond just a political change. Yes, might affect the environment as well. Certainly, changes in technology would affect the environment too, right? So, um, while we might categorize certain revolutions as primarily one type of revolution or another, they certainly have wide ranging effects. So let's begin with the American Revolution, which unfortunately we didn't get to cover last year in American history. But it is certainly one of the most influential events of the time period because it sort of sets an example for what is possible in terms of revolution and nationalism and nation building. Okay, so the ideas of the American Revolution certainly are tied to the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment thinkers we discussed before. They are uh, believers in natural rights and the ideas of democracy. They certainly already participate in democracy as English colonies, but they're looking for more representation for themselves. They also are looking for a free market economy. They're anti mercantilists. As we recall, mercantilism is an economic theory that says colonies should be established for the benefit of the home country and sort of taken advantage of or exploited for the benefit of the home country, which is great if you're the home country, in this situation, England, but not so great if you are the colonies, in this situation, the 13 English colonies in the United States. Okay. So we basically quickly discuss the causes. The colonists are more or less politically independent and self governing. The reason for that is honestly practical reasons. It's too far for the English king to actually govern these territories. So um, they, uh, they largely become self governing democratic mini states, right, if you will. And during this time, there's going to be a war, which we've already discussed, known as the 7 Years' War, from during the 1740s. And basically, what happens is, to recall, is England and France sort of have basically the First World War fighting each other all across the globe, from India to Africa to the New World. And as a result, England wins, but they have all this debt and they need to pay for soldiers because they take over Canada. And the English, rightly or wrongly, depending on your point of view, feel that the American colonists should now pay for their defense, pay for their own defense, because they benefited from English military power during the 7 Years' War. So these regulations and taxes are placed on the colonists. However, the colonists don't have representation in the English Parliament. So this is sort of the sticking point between the English colonies and the uh, the government in England is, what sort of representation, if any, should the English colonies have? Now, of course, because of that pesky economic policy of mercantilism, the home country, in this case England, feels that they have the right basically to take advantage of the Americans. And so this sort of starts off a conflict which begins with a series of political moves, and they try to negotiate, and there are economic boycotts, and a variety of different moves that play out, but eventually it leads to a full-on war between the 13 American colonies and England. Um, the war actually begins with the Declaration of Independence. This is why we celebrate. It's written on July 4th, published on July 4th, 1776, which is our holiday, the 4th of July, when we declare independence from England. And so it is written by Thomas Jefferson, who will become uh, president, the third American president. Don't quote me on that. And no, second, second or third. Anyway, it is heavily influenced by John Locke, the idea of unalienable rights. Now, connect this back to what we discussed in Unit 5.1 regarding slavery and those ideas of inalienable rights for some people, right? And also connect it towards ideas about feminism as well. Unalienable rights, natural rights for some people, not black people or slaves, and not women. So this is very much a sticking point or an issue that will come up later in American history. Um, Long story short, the Americans get help from the French, and they are able to defeat Britain in a long, drawn out war and become officially independent in 1789. Will become the United States of America as we know it in 1789. Um, Now, something I do want to point out here, this assistance from France is going to have an unintended consequence. France is basically looking to embarrass Great Britain, who is their long term rival, and they're going to spend a lot of money um, helping the American colonists defeat the English. But of course, that money is all borrowed. And eventually, it's going to have to be paid back. And the economic issues that causes are going to be a direct cause of the French Revolution, which we'll discuss later. Um, Another comparison here, another sort of experience with the English occurs in what is today New Zealand. Um, Great Britain annexes, takes over New Zealand in 1840, and they look to increase their control or assert their authority over the Maori tribes, natives of New Zealand. And the tribes that are there, the Maori tribes that are there, decide that they're going to fight back. And so, trying to lead to this idea or leading to this idea of Maori nationalism. And unfortunately, well, depends on your point of view, I guess, they don't defeat the British, right? And they remain even to this day under the control of the British, even if it's only in name, right? But they remain, part of the British Commonwealth, right? So uh, here you see two different experiences of colonies and the colonizers, right? The similarity being England. But you can see how these two different situations play out. So That's, I think, an important point, or at least an important example for us to understand in terms of New Zealand and how it compares to the American Revolution. Okay, so as we mentioned before in the last slide, uh, France helps the United States gain its independence from England, which is somewhat ironic because the United States, of course, becomes a constitutional republic with a president, no king, right? And democracy and elections. And France is ruled by an absolute king, Louis the 16th, right? And you can see how those ideas don't really match up, right? But it's certainly a situation of the enemy of my enemy is indeed my friend. Okay, so um, we'll get to um, the causes here, right? So, as we discussed, France is poor. They're out of money. The French government, especially, is out of money. They own. They've got debt because of the American Revolution and a number other costly wars that they weren't successful in. And so, when you spend more money than you make, there's only a couple solutions for that, right? Raise the taxes is the easiest one. So the French king calls the Estates General, and the Estates General can be compared to the English Parliament, but there's some key differences. All right, so first, the Estates General are made up of three groups: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, the commoners. Now, um, the way, in this sort of division in the Estates General, the clergy and the nobility oftentimes are allies or have the same point of view, right? This is mainly because the nobility and the clergy are related to each other in many situations. They're family, right? And they have similar interests in terms of economics, especially, right? So commoners make up 90%, 97% of French society, right? Um, but they don't they're not that much in the estates general, right? The way the estates general votes is each estate, the first estate the clergy, the second estate the nobility, and the third estate the commoners gets one vote, right? So that means the clergy and nobility, even though they only represent 3% of the population, actually get 67% of the votes, right? Because they get two votes compared to the third estates, the commoners, they're one, right? Now, the other issues here, the first and second estate enjoy special privileges as well compared to the um, third estate. And the issue of that, of course, right? The first and second estate are paying hardly any taxes at all, whereas the third estate is paying almost all of them, right? But they don't really have much of a say or much of a voice in how the money is spent, how the money is raised, what they pay taxes on, right? So all of these things sort of lead into bring us to a head right here um, in France in 1789. And so the States Generals are called, and while they're there, the commoners decide no more Estates General. We are going to make ourselves the National Assembly. And initially, right, um, the revolutionaries are more moderate, right? And they're just looking to establish, like, yes, we can keep the king, right? But the king with a set of rules similar to what was established in England. And so that's the initial goal of the revolution, but it quickly becomes more radical than that. And the French revolutionaries start to look for total changes to French society and government, right? And so, this is where we get the famous storming of the Bastille, where a group of Paris revolutionaries attack a French prison, and eventually uh, the king surrenders to the National Assembly. They agree to, abolish feudalism, get rid of all these rights that the First and Second Estates had, and create a new constitution, which they call the Declaration of Rights in Man, which we already discussed in Unit 5.1 with Olympe de Gouges sort of counter point the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Woman Citizen. Okay. So the Declaration of Rights in Man is heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinking, especially the American Constitution and the American Declaration of Independence, in addition to a lot of ideas from John Locke as well. So, um, the king says, "Nope, I don't think so. Right? I'd rather be an absolute monarch." He tries to run away to Germany, where his wife's family has control. And while he's on his way, he's captured. They bring him back to Paris and eventually cut his head off. So, um, this this becomes the beginning of the French Republic, right? And the king is dead, and so France becomes a constitutional republic, right? And as this new government gets started, there are unfortunately a lot of scores to settle, right? Or a lot of bad blood, a lot of rivalries that are needed to be taken care of, right? And so thousands are killed. This is where the guillotine becomes uh, the preferred method of execution, which is what cuts off King Louis XVI's head, along with his wife Marie Antoinette. And after this long period of turmoil, about 15 years or so, Napoleon Bonaparte takes control. He's a general from basically nowhere, right? And he's the one who's going to take control and make himself Emperor of France. But we will catch back up with uh, Napoleon later. Okay, so that's the French Revolution in a few minutes. Now, the French Revolution has a connection to the New World as well. All right, in this island called Haiti. Now, the Haitian Revolution is directly connected to the French Revolution because France owns Haiti at this point, right? And so this is Haiti at the time is, you know, basically a sugar plantation or a sugar growing island uh, with lots of slaves and a few white uh, slave owners, French slave owners, right? And so uh, it basically, the Haitian Revolution starts as a slave uprising, right? The Maroons, who are escaped slaves from all over the Caribbean, um, go to Haiti when they hear about this happening, and they're going to be led by a guy named Toussaint L'Ouverture, right? Who was a former slave, and he joins the rebellion. And it's a simple matter of numbers. There are very few, uh, white French slave owners on the island, and the um, the slaves are going to win militarily and establish an independent government, right? And in 1801, Toussaint Louverture will create the Haitian government that um, basically models itself after the American government and the French government of the time. Okay, and so is the Constitution gives all people equality and citizenship, all people the right to vote. Quite extreme for its time, right? Now, after that, he starts to make some more questionable decisions. Okay, um, and he's going to declare himself governor for life. Not exactly the most democratic thing to do. And then split plantations between former slaves and free black people, meaning creating social divisions. All right, he's eventually going to be imprisoned by France and die there in 1803. All right, he is succeeded by this guy, Jean Jacques Dessalines, and he says, "Okay, hey France, we are going to be permanently independent. Don't come back." All right, so this is significant because they are the first country in Latin America, South America, and the Caribbean to win their independence. All right, now uh, the other important point about the Haitian Revolution to understand is that yes, this is a country that will be led by former slaves, right? And this very much, and they're also implementing Enlightenment ideas, right? Modern, sort of progressive ideas about democracy and economics and social equality, these kinds of things, and it very much goes against the narrative or the story the Europeans have been telling themselves that they were superior to the Africans, and so therefore it was okay to enslave them, right? So the Haitian Revolution is really a significant piece of evidence for the Europeans to say or to sort of double check this, right? Think about this again, right? That well, maybe that's not the case, right? And you'll see that there's the time period here, right? 1801. Is when the Haitian Constitution comes into effect. It's not soon after that that abolition really takes off and starts in Europe, right? So the two are definitely connected. All right. Now, to compare these two, right, between the French and the Haitian revolutions, right? Obviously, they're both uh, encouraged by Enlightenment ideas, and that men had natural rights. Um, they were restricted socially, right? The vast majority of the people, we talked about 97% of French people were commoners. Similar numbers, 97, 98% of Haitians were slaves. So this restriction socially leads to these huge changes politically. All right. Now, of course, the big difference, though, of course, is in Haiti, though those 97% of people were slaves, while as in France, those large majority of people had some rights, even if not full rights compared to their peers. Okay, so that's Haiti. Let's move on to the Creole revolutions in Latin America. So basically, these are the conflicts that lead to independence for South America. And to quickly remind ourselves of the social structure in Latin America, we discussed these before, right? But it is a very top down social structure, right? And the layers are very distinct. It's almost like a caste system. Okay. At the top, you got the peninsulares, who are actually born on the peninsula, right? Spain or Portugal. Uh, Underneath them, the Creoles, right? They were born in America, but have two European parents. The mestizos are mestizos and mulattoes have one European parent, uh, usually a father, but not necessarily, and either one Native American parent or one African parent. In the case of the mestizos, Native American, and the mulattoes, African, right? Below them, Africans, um, whether free or enslaved, and then sort of bringing up the bottom, the Native Americans who are there, including the Aztecs, Mayas, Incas, Navajo, Apaches. There's a general sense that these people are sort of lowest on the uh, social scale. Okay. Now, obviously, uh, the Peninsulares are going to be a very small minority, especially as changes happen in Europe and less people start to immigrate to the New World. It's going to be the Creoles, the the uh, people who were born of Spanish descent that live in the New World that are going to be the ones who are the primary drivers or the primary motivation for these uh, for these revolutions in Latin America and South America. So the Creoles were obviously upset with Spain's mercantilist policies. We can compare this pretty easily with what was going on in the English colonies at the time. Spain is taking advantage of the its colonies in the New World, right? So the Creoles and mestizos wanted more political power, and they resent the high status of the peninsulares, the ones that are there, right? So, it's basically a very, it's a situation where you can see, okay, we've got people who have economic power, but not much political or social status. Right, the Creoles are the ones who make the money and participate in the world economy, and in the meantime, the Spanish, who were born in Spain but now live in the New World, have higher status in these political positions, et cetera, et cetera. And this is going to lead to, it sets up our conflict here, right? And so the these are known as the Bolivar revolutions, right? Um, After a guy named Simon Bolivar. He is, we can basically call him the Latin American George Washington. And uh, he's a guy that Bolivia, the country of Bolivia, is named after. And he was uh, a Creole, right? He's rich and well versed in Enlightenment ideas. He is um, looking to motivate the other Creoles first, right? They're primarily initially looking for um, reform of what's the Spanish Empire in the New World, right? Not necessarily independence, but eventually it does translate to a desire for independence. Now, an important point here, right? They are not looking for assistance from the mestizos and the Native Americans and the mulattoes because they see what happened in Haiti and they think, oh, like we're probably that if that happens to us, we're going to be the ones, with our heads getting chopped off, right? So Simon Bolivar becomes the leader in of the sort of resistance movement, the Creole resistance to Spanish rule in what is today Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, throughout this part of uh, South America. Okay, right. Um, so um, he is going to write a letter called the Jamaica Letter. And the Jamaica Letter is very similar to the American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. We can look at it as sort of a founding document for these countries that outlines exactly what they want, why they want it, and sort of the reasons that they feel they deserve additional rights and uh, additional independence. Okay, and so Spain is not going to take this without a fight, or is not going to accept independence, Spanish, or sorry, independence from Spain without a fight. And a long war is fought between the Spanish and the Creoles and eventually the mestizos and mulattoes get involved as well, and they um, are able to win independence, defeat the Spanish, and win de facto, right, or actual independence from Spain over a period of time. Okay, and Simon Bolivar establishes a new country. He calls it Gran Colombia. The outline there, which you can see there. Okay, um, and of course, conflict like this is expensive and destructive, and it's basically a civil war, and so this becomes very challenging for Latin America economically, and socially as well, right? And as the war drags on, the armies that are fighting become loyal to the caudillos, right? Basically, we might think of them as warlords, right? They're local leaders who are in control because they have control of the army. Okay, so as a result, right, there are new constitutions and new governments instituted in Latin America, but things don't change that much as far as from a cultural perspective, right? The indigenous peoples are still way down on the bottom of the social pyramid, even though they represent a majority of the population. And most non Spanish speakers are still denied their rights. The Creole class um, sort of replaces the Peninsulares and remain pretty conservative. Okay. And so, unfortunately, excuse me, unfortunately, women also gain little in terms of uh, actual rights during the Creole revolutions in Latin America. The patriarchy still reigns. All right. A couple other challenges to Spanish rule that we might point out over time. Right. An important woman poet emerges or comes out in uh, uh, the Caribbean. She's living in Puerto Rico and Cuba. Her name is Lola Rodriguez de Tio, and her writings encourage the ideas of equality in education, and do lead to uprisings against Spain in Puerto Rico and Cuba. Though those uprisings are actually defeated, and they will remain part of Spain until the late 1800s. Spain also controls the uh, Philippines at this time, and educational opportunities there are actually limited, right? Especially for native Filipinos. And so, if they want to get educated, they go to Europe, and while they're there, they are exposed to these Enlightenment ideas. They come back, bringing these ideas with them, um, and in which leads to growing nationalism and Republican democratic movements in the Philippines. And um, This sort of comes to a head when Jose Rizal starts what he calls the propaganda movement, right? Um, and he starts printing documents and stuff, not necessarily saying that the Philippines should be independent, but instead that there should be changes. And In response, the Spanish authorities put Jose Rizal in jail and kill him. And This is shocking to the Filipino population, and they rise up and they start fighting for real independence in 1896. But unfortunately, this is the same time the Americans decide they are going to fight the Spanish too. And when they defeat Spain in the Spanish American War, they're going to say, oh, you've got the Philippines. Well, we'll take that as well. So the Philippines don't actually get their real independence until after uh, World War II because they're controlled by the Americans up until that point. So let's move forward to nationalism and unification in Europe. We're going to look at two examples very quickly. First is the example of Italy. Okay. And then our second example will be in Germany as well. Okay. So the Italians, have were basically divided into separate city states and local kingdoms, small kings and princes, and all that kind of stuff for hundreds of years. Basically, since the fall of the Roman Empire, no one country or even the Italians themselves have ruled over the entire Italian peninsula. And that was great. We discussed that in the Renaissance. Okay, that's great. It leads to competition between the city states and all those other kinds of things. But as all these other states, France and Spain and England, sort of start their nation building, right, empire building, in the 1700s, 16 to 1700s, Italy kind of gets left behind, right, because they're not united together. All right, so there is a guy called the Count de Cavour. He is the prime minister to a Italian king in the north, the king of Piedmont, Sardinia, and he decides, like, look, if we're going to really be players in the world stage, we need to unite together. All right. And he uses this idea that is called realpolitik, right? Or the idea of practical politics, right? Real politics. That combined with uh, um, Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and democracy and those kinds of things, to start a series of wars that leads to weakening outside influence, basically weakening French and Austrian influence in Italy, right? And the Italians, sort of an idea of Italy for the Italians, if that makes sense, right? That's the idea for nationalism there in Italy, right? And he gets a guy to fight for him, right? It says Giuseppe Mazzini, and um, he is going to be the sort of military, figurehead, political leader of this movement, and he is going to help unify Italy. Now, the problem, of course, is like Italy is still significantly behind these um, other states around them, these other modern European states around them, like France or England, specifically the Netherlands as well. And that means that Italy is going to remain relatively poor and backward throughout the 1800s. As industrialization eventually takes hold, that position will change in the early 1900s, but throughout the 1800s, it will remain quite, while united together, still not a major player in European politics. Okay, now, on the other hand, we are now going to discuss German unification, which is going to directly lead to World War One. All right. So let's rewind to Napoleon, right? So we know Napoleon which we'll discuss later. But Napoleon takes over large portions of Europe, including large portions of Germany. Right. So there's still a lot of French control. And as this sort of progresses, there's a nationalist movement led by this Prussian leader, Otto von Bismarck, right? Um, and he starts to think, you know what? Let's put all, if Germany were united together, we would be the most powerful nation in Europe, right? And as you can see down here on the map, Prussia is sort of this area here, the sort of northeastern part of what is today actually not really German territory anymore, right? A lot of this is Poland, Belarus, some other areas, but it is at the time the state of Prussia. And he's saying, well, if we could unite all of these areas together, here's southern Germany down here, and these areas in northern Germany and central Germany as well, combined with us, well, then we would be the new sort of big boy in Europe, right? And he starts using his sort of techniques of realpolitik, and he starts a couple of wars that he knows he's going to win, right? And so, he sort of plays people against each other. We could think of realpolitik as almost a continuation of what Machiavelli wrote about in the 1400s with the Prince, right? He's basically taking Machiavelli's ideas into the 19th century, right? And he wins a bunch of wars, two against Austria, and another one against France. And as he wins these wars and wins these conflicts, people like to support a winner, I think is sort of the best way to put it, right? He gets these other central German states in here to join his side, join the Prussians, and eventually he gets the southern area of Bavaria to join with him as well. And by 1871, uh, he establishes a kingdom of Germany led by the Kaiser, right? Which, of course, you would remember from grade 10 when you learned about Kaiser Wilhelm, right? And so this unification of Germany creates a powerful industrial state in the heart of Europe. And that powerful state is going to be a threat to, or seen as a threat to the traditional powers of Europe, specifically France and the United Kingdom, England. In addition to that, Russia as well, right? So eventually, this nationalism and unification in Europe, specifically in Germany and Italy, are going to create, sort of a new balance of power in Europe, which will directly lead to World War One. Two more examples in Europe. First, in the Balkans. Okay, that is this area here, sort of far eastern tip of Europe, including what is today Bosnia, Serbia, Herzegovina, a variety of other areas, Macedonia, and these countries are sort of the meeting ground between the Islamic East, in this case, the Ottomans, and the Christian West. So they're a mixed area of Christians and Muslims, but they definitely don't fit in with kind of either side, if that makes sense, right? They don't particularly have a lot of cultural similarity with Western Europe, and they also don't have a lot of cultural similarity with uh, the Ottoman East. Okay, so um, we know that we discussed uh, Suleiman the Magnificent, right, who got all the way to Vienna in Austria-Hungary in the 1400s. But by the late 1600s, early 1700s, we see that um, the Ottoman Empire is sort of starting to pull back, and that other countries like Austria and other countries like Russia are going to start to put pressure on the Ottomans. And this is where the Balkan nationalism develops in this environment. So uh, in 1827, at the Vienna Congress, um, Greece works out sort of a deal to get its independence with support from Great Britain, France, and Russia against the Ottomans, right? And so this is sort of the first big step, right, towards the fall of the Ottoman Empire, right, or at least um, the Europeans' efforts, the Western Europeans' efforts to limit its control, right, or limit its power, right. And in other areas in the Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Ottoman pullback is also going to lead to new ideas for nationalism and independence. Now, this is going to fast forward and be very important because it's going to be one of these Balkan nationalists who assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which is sort of the event that directly leads to World War One. Okay, so put a pin in Balkan nationalism, even though they haven't fought their wars for independence quite yet. They will. Okay, now uh, the Ottoman Empire does not take this all laying down, right? And there are efforts by the Ottomans to reform and to sort of keep up with the times, right? And this is called the New Ottomanism. Okay, and so the idea is to sort of create an Ottoman identity um, that is sort of based on these Enlightenment nationalist ideas, and sort of keep up with the times almost as a way to think about that. Now, this is significantly different from the way the Ottoman Empire had operated for hundreds of years. We discussed the different uh, strategies that the Ottoman Turks used to operate and control their empire. With the importing importing Christian uh, slaves and importing, taking Christians from the Balkans to be their administrators, and sort of allowing religious tolerance in the different religious communities. And so, um, prior to this, the Ottomans had been very hands off about, sort of uniting under a shared identity. Right? It was almost like it's okay. We're Ottomans. You're Egyptians. You're Syrian. Whatever. That's fine. Right? So you just be who you are, and we'll be who we are. But we'll work together, right? And so this is a significant change to say no, like let's be Ottoman, right? And they encourage this through education, which actually this is a very key point to understand here. The role that education plays in establishing not only the Ottoman identity, but in establishing a lot of these national identities. We'll also see the establishment of a public school system, free public schooling in France around this time, right, in order to promote the ideas of democracy, right? So there is a connection here between using the education system and promoting these Enlightenment nationalist democratic ideas. Okay, now the other ethnic groups within the Ottoman Empire do not uh, follow along with this policy. They don't think it's a good idea, and it shows how unhappy people actually were with the Ottoman Empire right at this time. So it's going to actually have the opposite effect of, instead of uniting the country, um, it's going to actually sort of drive the Ottoman Empire further apart, or sort of split it up even more. Okay. And so uh, it has this opposite effect, right? So, unification and nationalism in Italy or in Germany can sort of be contrasted with what happens in the Ottoman Empire at this time. And eventually, the Ottomans will sort of limp along to World War One, and then lose in World War One when they ally with Germany, and that will lead to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of a wide variety of states, um, Kuwait included, but much beyond that, Egypt, Algeria, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, and the modern states of Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria. So this huge empire that had ruled a wide array of people and subjects is going to break apart. Okay, so we've discussed enough out of the nationalist movements and revolutions in all over the world, from the New World to the Old World, and I would like you to keep in mind for all of those that there are going to be wide-ranging effects that are going to also be impacted by the Industrial Revolution. Okay, thanks for listening, and we will continue with Unit 5.3 and 5.4, the Industrial